I'm going to completely disagree, but I can also understand why someone might say that. Compliance won't equal security if you're complying with something that's insecure. How's that? But if you have a culture of security that defines the ground rules that are secure, compliance and security, they not only go hand in hand, they're a must.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Heroes, an Iron Scales podcast about you, the heroes of cybersecurity. You're about to hear and learn practical and experiential knowledge in our conversations with CISOs, security directors and architects, SOC analysts, and other InfoSec stars so we can become more cyber resilient and safer together. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Heroes. I'm your host for today's episode, Brendan Rudd, Community Director at IronScales, an email security platform powered by AI, enhanced by thousands of customer security teams, and built around detecting and removing threats in the inbox. We offer a service that is fast to deploy, easy to operate, and is unparalleled in the ability to stop all types of email threats, including advanced attacks like business email compromise, account takeover, and more. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get into the show. Hey Al, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for taking the time to join us today on Cybersecurity Heroes. Before we begin, would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about you, your background, and what you're up to these days?
Oh man, that's a long background. Look at the gray in my beard. You sure you want to hear all of that? So I've been in technology since the mid-'80s, involved in compliance and security since the late '90s, believe it or not. We started it. I own a channel company, meaning we supply SaaS-based platform services to the IT service provider space. But I also am an IT service provider. I have another company where we provide IT services. And in fact, that's how my channel business came to being. It was born of a cyber practice that we started in the MSP. And so, because of my long tenure in security and compliance, it was a natural evolution in the MSP to stand up that practice, and it was wildly successful when we launched it, and that's really what gave birth to CyberGuard 360. And these days, my passion is just spreading the cyber gospel, as I like to say it, and keeping my colleagues and their clients safe and secure by changing their concept of security through the lens of culture.
And speaking of gospel, you've written a grand total of 4 books and one on the way.
That is true. So the 5th book's actually, I did the final edits about a week and a half ago, and I'm expecting it to be in print by October.
Congrats.
And it's actually, so we started the series started completely. It's a series called Revealed is the name of the series, and it really started quite accidentally many years ago when I wanted to get into marketing our business, and so the first one was like how to hire someone who's good at their job kind of thing, and when we started thinking about it, when people most consumers of IT services, in fact, of cybersecurity services too, they're novices and they don't know what questions to ask or what to look for. It is almost a pure trust play, meaning that because the concept of technology and security is so foreign to the typical user, they just have to believe you. And so it's really an entire relationship built on trust. And so what I wanted to do was give the consuming public of IT and security services a way to sort of measure whether or not that trust was warranted. And so I said, okay, maybe Revealed would be a good first title, Revealed on how to hire or how to find and hire an IT provider. And a lot of people were like, wow, that was a great book. You should do more of those. Like, wow, okay, we'll do a whole Revealed series. That's all. That's sort of how that came to be. And we're on our 5th book coming out in October. So, and I've actually got 2 more in mind, and then I'm done. And then 1 more other book, and then I really am done. So.
So you talked about the inspiration for the first book being about building trust. Can you maybe shed a little insights into the follow-up books of this series? What was the inspiration and objective of each book?
So the first one was because relationships in our field, and this is true basically in any field that is foreign to whoever the final consumer is. Think about the medical field. How many people know if their doctor's any good? You know, luckily, I guess, or unluckily, with social media and the democratization of information for the most part, it's given an opportunity to find out some of the information that prior to the social media platforms, you wouldn't know if your doctor was good or not, right? It's only now that other people can say this one's good or that one's good, and do it at volume, meaning they can broadcast it to world.
If I can stop you for a second for a slight sidetrack, I would play the devil's advocate and also say not all advice should be treated equally. That's one byproduct of social media that you need to be careful of.
Yeah, you definitely have to consider the source. And I say that religiously. There's an old saying that I've lived by long before social media, as my gray and my beard would attest to. Believe half of what you see and none of what you hear. Right? And so generally, I'm a big fan of crowdsourcing genius. Right? So if just 1 or 2 people tell me something about a particular company or practitioner or whatever, chances are they're disgruntled for some reason or another, right? Because almost nobody takes the time to write a thank you letter. Everybody takes the time to bitch and complain. That's just a fact of life. I always go out of my way to praise people because I live by that edict. Everybody's willing to bitch and complain. Almost nobody's willing to praise and throw approbations at people. So I like to go out of my way and do that, but it's few and far between that do. That doesn't make me better than anybody. I'm just saying that I do that. That's my own ethos. And so when a few people say something about somebody, I tend to think they're just complaining about it, right? They've had a bad experience or whatnot. But at some point, you reach critical mass. And if you reach critical mass, and that's going to be a subjective point, so I don't mean to imply that I can tell you what that number is. But at critical mass, you have to start thinking to yourself, well, maybe there's some credibility. That's what I mean by crowdsourcing genius. That if enough people say something about somebody or some entity or something, that there's probably some credibility to it, right? And so now you have to do a due diligence. That's all. So I completely agree with you. Understanding social media can be just as bad at advice as it can be good, probably more so bad at advice than good at advice.
Yeah. I think it's, to your point, democratizing information in the right channels, in the right use cases is extremely powerful. I mean, I know from experience, we do it with intelligence in our platform, and other companies are starting to do the same thing, crowdsourcing that threat intelligence, feeding it back into their products and back into their customer community. So yeah, I agree with you that it's super powerful, as you say, crowdsourcing genius. I really like that. I like that term.
And it's funny you say, because we do that in our platform too. I mean, one of our, a brief commercial interruption. One of the raison d'etres for our PII Guard platform is not because we wanted to offer dark web or we wanted to offer phishing or we wanted to offer training, but the intelligence you can get from tens of thousands of people who use the platform and then behave a certain way as a result of it, give us the ability to in an unfiltered, unbiased, objective way, convey best practices. And that's actually where social media falls down, right? Because social media is perfectly biased, wholly subjective, including the social media companies that decide who can speak and when they can speak, right? So everybody throughout the entire social media chain has a personality bias or proclivity towards something that make the information jaded at best. But when you're dealing with ones and zeros, and the user and the personality of the user is irrelevant. So what is relevant is the behavior. Behavior is a great predictor of the future because people almost never change their behavior.
I know we digressed a little bit, but
That was a tangent.
but that was super interesting. But yeah, coming back to your inspiration and objectives for your series of books.
So really, that's what it was. I wanted to give people an opportunity to sort of consider the world in front of them from they quickly morphed into a series of cybersecurity books. Because cybersecurity is so opaque at best. Opaque it's probably opaque would be at worst, perhaps. That I really wanted to give the readership the opportunity to think about it in an objective way without having to rely on whomever it is was the pundit of the day, so to speak, right? Because again, removing the personality from it and giving them an opportunity to just have some facts in front of them and make some decisions in a plain English, no nonsense, free of technobabble sort of way. Because I can sit up here all day long and use acronyms and speak of threat vector and attack surfaces and all of the other things that, to the layman, their eyes would start to glaze over after a few minutes, and I wouldn't blame them. But if you can take in the information in a way, in a conversational tone, without any of the technobabble, you walk away knowing a little bit more, and hopefully you make a more informed decision. And really, that was the inspiration behind the whole concept of Reveal. If you think about the first one, was like just sort of helping people hire better people without having to rely on just, I have a good feeling for you, which was really uncovering those traits that you look for. And why not just expand that into cybersecurity and social media and all the other different facets? So that's really what the inspiration for the whole series was, which is why, as I said, I've already got a few more in my head because there's a couple of other things that I just sort of want to uncover. And then I'm pretty much done. Pretty much is what I said about the second book, by the way. But so
you keep getting inspired.
That's it. Something strikes right. It's like, oh, I should totally do something on that. And, it's not like I make money at it. I just do that in hopes that the 3 people that read it get something from it. That's all.
And other than writing books, you spoke to me about being passionate about culture and compliance. But if we go into culture for a bit, what is cybersecurity culture to you?
Oh, that's a great. That's a great question. I just did a whole speaking session on this. I was in Chicago earlier this week, as a matter of fact. Culture and compliance go hand in hand. And in fact, security and culture, without culture, you have no security. Or maybe more accurately, the wrong culture breeds insecurity. There's an analogy that I use that seems to go over well with audiences when I'm speaking. That, if you think about, do you have any kids, Brendan?
Yeah, one little one.
Okay, so I've got 3 kids. They're all in their 20s, so they're not running. Well, they're running around somewhere. I don't know where, and I don't think I want to know, frankly. But so if you think when your kids are little, and kids are like every other user on planet Earth. They're just perhaps they're better users because they're unencumbered by their own biases, so to speak, at the time. But if you think about kids, and kids love cookies, and I always use the cookie jar analogy, right? You have cookies or some sort of snack you like to keep on the counter, and if your child comes in and steals a cookie out of the cookie jar, and you're in the kitchen or your wife's in the kitchen, turn around and yell, the kid drops the cookie, runs away, crying, scared for their life, right? Tomorrow they do it again, you yell again, they drop, same thing. This goes on for a solid week. And then at some point, 3, 5, 7 days into it, they keep the cookie and run away. And the next time they keep the cookie and run away. And the next time they eat it in front of you. And what you're doing is you're setting a culture of permissiveness. Because what you're basically doing is saying it's perfectly okay to steal that cookie. The worst I'm going to do to you is yell at you, and by the time we sit at the table, I will have forgotten completely. And you would have been rewarded for your bad behavior because the only punishment for that was getting yelled at, which is no big deal. You get yelled at for a lot of reasons as a kid. I know I get yelled at as an adult for a lot of reasons. So culture breeds a behavioral norm that when you're talking about security, you're basically allowing permissiveness of bad behavior. And that creates the ability for the attack surface to expand. I said I wouldn't use attack surface earlier. I apologize. So, the bad guys can get in when people aren't paying attention. And people don't pay attention unless they have to. So if you think about employees for a moment, much like the kid with the cookie jar, right? Your employees want to do their job. That kid just wants his cookie. They want to do their job and go home. And they like to do it well. They'll do it to the best of their ability. That's not to say they won't have bad days. But in general, people go to work to do the best job they can and then go home when it's all over. That's what they do. And when you put up roadblocks to doing it quickly or efficiently, those are roadblocks they want to get around, like the cookie jar, right? Getting yelled at is a roadblock to that. But if you don't put those roadblocks up and then enforce that they be followed instead of climbed over, what do you think is going to happen? They're going to do anything they want to do to get their job done. And so if you're not setting about a culture in your organization of defined security, clean desk policies, acceptable use policies, permissible website policies, and some of this you can do technologically, but a lot of it you can't do technologically. Clean desk policies you can't do technologically, as an example. So a clean desk policy is a very strong security measure. But more importantly, it sets the tone for what is expected of the employee. It sets a cultural tone. How does the company think, feel, and believe, and therefore behave about the security posture of its organization? And then will it enforce it, yes or no? And the behavior defines enforcement, right? So, or behavior is an outcome of enforcement. That's not to say negative enforcement, because there's positive enforcement as well. There's negative and positive enforcement. But culture defines behavior. Policies and procedures are the memorialization of those cultures. So, for instance, if I want people to make sure that we protect employee data, I'm looking out at my office now. One of the ways I want my team to know that we believe in protecting data is through a clean desk policy that I'm going to memorialize in a document that they're going to be forced to attest to, and then I am going to periodically check to make sure it's being applied, it's being used properly. Same thing with locking your desk when you're done at the end of the day, or making sure that you lock your computer at the end of when you walk away from your desk, or all of the other things that get from a cultural position get defined in policy and executed in action and enforcement. And together they make up culture.
In your opinion, where do you see culture being the biggest enabler to cybersecurity breaches?
Well, I would say the lack of culture, or a culture of permissiveness, right? So if you consider the fact that 90% of all successful better than 90%, but let's use 90% as the bottom level of that, of all successful cyber attacks are caused by humans. Intentionally or unintentionally isn't relevant for a moment. Most of the time it's unintentional. So they click on a link they shouldn't. They go to a website they shouldn't visit. They put a USB stick they don't know where it came from in the machine. There's 1,000 ways that this happens. And the reason it works is because the company doesn't have a culture of security, one that demands their employees be suspect of everything. So we have a client in Texas, in my MSP. We have a client in Texas who came to us by way of a breach. And what had happened was the CEO's social media profile was being monitored by bad actors. They were a targeted company, and they had actually been infected originally by a business email compromise. And so the business email compromise, for everybody who listens to this who doesn't know what that is, basically what that means is that some victim fell for a phishing attack and gave their credentials to a bad actor through a very real-looking, albeit fake web page that collected their Office 365 credentials. And so now the bad actors had the email credentials of one of the users, and they moved laterally through the 365 tenant until they were able to get admin privileges, and then they could impersonate other users. And so they had targeted this company, and they, through the social media, realized that the CEO was going away on holiday with his family and was basically going to be in the air now for 6 hours to fly overseas. And almost from the moment they got to the airport, the attacker sent an email to the admin to wire $25 million offshore to a vendor so they wouldn't lose the deal. And because he was getting on a plane, he would contact her when he landed to confirm it was done. And she did it.
Wow.
So he lost $25 million in that. Nobody had any idea, right? So that's a permissive culture of security, because they had never done awareness training. They had no policies in place that said, so anything like that. And one of the things I tell our clients in my MSP is any kind of a transfer has to require a voice confirmation. I will never get on a plane and tell you to wire money. I will give somebody else in the company authority to make that wire transfer verbally. And so they don't have policies like that. They accepted this email. That's a $25 million example, but it's just one example in a series of examples that I can give you that are not dissimilar to that. And it's because there's a culture that has been set up to make their jobs easier and therefore less secure, necessarily so. They should have had a policy in place that no transfer requests would be made by email, or any email transfer requests would have to have a verbal confirmation either by the person making the transfer or a second person. That's a simple policy to create, and it's not a terribly difficult policy to enforce, right? Because it just means me, Mr. CEO, just has to tell my CFO, hey, this is happening, have her make the transfer and let her know.
So it's almost like there's a third layer that's missing in a lot of companies. We all focus on technology, training and awareness, but policy is probably not thought about as much, specifically with regards to business email compromise, where most of the fraudulent actions are based on transfers, and that comes down to process.
Oh, many. I mean, in the mortgage industry, it's the number one form of attack. So, and it comes by way of business email compromise, and frequently they compromise the lawyer or the title company, believe it or not. And then right before the transaction goes down, they change the wiring instructions and they basically get, a few $100,000 here, a few $100,000 there. And before anybody's any of the wiser, that money's hopped several banks and sitting somewhere in a foreign country.
Cybersecurity Heroes is brought to you by IronScales, an AI-powered, self-learning email security platform that helps security professionals proactively prevent, detect, and remediate phishing attacks in a matter of seconds, not hours or days. And we have an exclusive offer for our podcast listeners. Discover dormant phishing threats in your organization's mailboxes. Get a free 90-day scan back with a detailed report. Integrate in seconds with 2 clicks via API to Microsoft Office 365 and see what your current email security is missing. Go to ironscales.com/free scan to learn more.
So you talked about coming from a disciplined background, and you mentioned being passionate about compliance. So why are you passionate about compliance? Is it just a coincidence that you were drawn to it, or does it come from your background and how you grew up?
Probably a little bit of both, at the risk of being too general there. So for me, when I talk about compliance, people hear compliance and there's this whole fear of rules, regulations, oversight, mounds of paperwork, auditors coming in and giving you a proctology exam, all of those fun things that come to people's mind when they hear the word compliance. For me, compliance is nothing but the rules in which we're going to have a relationship. So think about it more generically. You said you have a child. I assume you're married. You and your wife have a relationship based on a set of rules that you've both agreed to comply with, right? And so compliance is nothing but it's a normative structure of a relationship, and they define a level playing field. I'm certain, and again, I don't want to speak for your marriage. I'm just going to use you as an example on this call, but I'm certain that your rules as a husband are not different than her rules as a wife. You don't have to stay home while she gets to go out every night, or vice versa, right? It's a set of ground rules that allow a relationship to flourish and everybody to have the best experience they can with each other in that framework. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think you had a funnier version of saying that the last time we spoke, something about having the most fun without causing anybody harm or something like that.
Right. That's always my punchline. It allows everybody to have the most fun they can without hurting anybody along the way. It's like, have fun, do no harm is always and that's really what that is. This says this is how our relationship is going to work. Now, as long as you operate in that framework, have as much fun as you possibly can. But these are the rules to which we're going to have a relationship. And that's really all compliance is. And you might say that, well, that there's auditors, there's this and there's that. But yeah, that's true in our personal relationships too, right? I mean, you come home and you're audited by your spouse. You go into the office and you're audited by your colleagues that you work next to. And is it a formal audit? No, not unless you're on the verge of a divorce. But it's just all an audit is a confirmation and a check and balance. And we do that naturally in our relationships by the way in which we transact our relationships personally and professionally. But all compliance says is, okay, listen, this is how we're going to behave, and this is how I'm going to confirm we're going to behave. And I have a passion for compliance because it allows me, and in the relationships I have, to have as much fun as I can and make sure I'm not hurting you. And for you to have as much fun as you can and make sure you're not hurting me. And together, if we're having fun, we're going to get the most out of this relationship too. It's going to give us both an opportunity to flourish and succeed in that relationship. And so when I think about compliance that way, I look at culture through that lens too. So that if you set the ground rules, because ultimately compliance is an adherence to the cultural ground rules, right? So if you define the ground rules through culture and memorialize them and document them through policy and procedure, compliance is just an adherence to those policies and procedures that let everybody be the best they can at what they do without hurting the guy next to them or the girl next to them.
And if we will narrow this down in terms of like, where does compliance have the greatest impact in info security? Because many people will tell you that compliance does not equal secure.
I would absolutely disagree. So actually, I'm going to completely disagree, but I can also understand why someone might say that. Compliance won't equal security if you're complying with something that's insecure. How's that? But if you have a culture of security that defines the ground rules that are secure, compliance and security, they not only go hand in hand, they're a must. Right? So I'll go back to my business email compromise and the bank transfer. If there had been a culture of security that was defined through a set of rules that said never transfer money over $1 million, they were $1 billion company. Never transfer anything. Let's say 100,000, over 100,000, without senior management's verbal approval. That money never would have left the company. If those were the rules and everybody had to comply with them. So compliance equals security because again, compliance are nothing but adhering to the rules, and the rules are defined in policies and procedures, which are the memorialization of culture, right? So it's a cascading effect. So culture says we want to do this. I memorialize them in policies and procedures, and then I verify you're doing it and therefore complying, right? So if you're defining your culture of security in the right way, you are inherently secure when you comply. When you don't comply, you're inherently insecure, right? So that business email compromise was somewhat exaggerative. I'll give you something even smaller, right? A little more annoying, but smaller. We have another client. Actually, this is one of our partners' clients in our SaaS company. One of our partner clients, one of our partners' clients, one of their policies always hover over the from email to see if the underlying email is the actual email address of the person that it came from, right? Even if you think you know them, and that policy has saved them from a business email compromise. I can't tell you how many phishing attacks that they report in, but it's regularly, because there's a policy in place that this is what you have to do, and because they use our platform for fake phishing, I know that they report all of those phishing links. He knows they report all of those phishing links, so he knows compliance is way up. And by definition, all those business email compromise attacks are not successful because they're being reported. And not just the simulated phishing, the real ones too, by the way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so if I kind of summarize, compliance can equal security if your security strategy is robust and you're not missing out on key elements of your program.
Exactly. And this is really where, and this I actually think is where the entire IT service and IT security space is moving. That ultimately, those that are going to be the most successful will become the consigliaries of the companies that they service, helping them to define policy and procedures that create a culture of security. So if people ask me why we built our platform, and that's exactly why we built our platform. We want to enable our colleagues in the IT space by giving them the tools to help them to secure their clients through changes in culture. So if you think about, we have silos of modules in the platform, but they come together in the reporting to give the visibility business needs to make a decision. And so there's an old saying in business: don't expect what you can't inspect. I'm sure you've heard that before. So, all of these platforms that are out there, they do a great job at providing tools that give you silos of security. But if they're not uncovering behavioral abnormalities, how do you know where you're insecure? You don't. And so one of the reasons we built our platform is because our phishing talks to our dark web, which talks to our policy management, which talks to our risk assessment, which talks to our policy attestations, which talks to our awareness training. And it allows us to watch behavior of users. So think about this for a second. If I can tell you on average how many reminder emails we have to send out before your employees bother to take the awareness training. Now you may say, so what? Well, I say that if I have to send on average 5 emails, what are the likelihood those employees are going to listen to you the first time you tell them to do something? Goes way down. That's the value of visibility, because don't expect what you can't inspect. And so we built the platform to provide that visibility to the MSP, who can now go and say, look, your users need to step up their game. Look at them. I had to send them 5 reminder emails to attest to the acceptable use policy, 7 emails to take the training. They still haven't done anything with phishing. So you're able to give them visibility into their culture of security by the way their people behave. And now maybe we need to put on a layer of more policies, or maybe enforcement, or maybe the IT provider steps up and becomes the enforcer. I don't mean literally, but goes in and says, hey, we need to have a meeting, HR and this employee, and let me show you, and I will be the third party in that meeting to show you where they're falling down. That relationship is an intimate one with a company, and one that really not only takes the relationship to the next level, but takes revenue to the next level. Because one of the things, Deloitte did a survey, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, and over 99% of the CEOs, these were small middle market to, no, actually that's not true, it was SMB to middle market. Over 99% of the CEOs knew they owned risk. They knew it was their responsibility to ensure that they mitigated the risk of the company. And so when you are able to show where the risk of the company comes from in their people, they'll pay you almost anything to help mitigate it. And my MSPs prove positive of that. We make a lot of money doing that today, because we show them this is how your people are behaving. You need to help me help you.
So I want to go back for a second to your example of the policy at one of your partners' companies, I think you said, where they are expected to hover over the email to check the from address, that it matches the real sender. So do you think that's fair on employees to have that pressure, not making a mistake with a single letter in the email? Because we know that cyber criminals are obfuscating and using different Cyrillic or Greek letters to trick users into thinking an A is the same A as from the Greek alphabet, for example. I'm just giving like some examples. There are many other tactics that are being used. But my point is, if there's technology that could prevent or help users not have to have that burden, would you say we should transfer that to technology? Or how much of a burden do you expect companies to put on their employees to detect sophisticated or non-sophisticated attacks?
So I like your choice of words. um, so a couple of things. What I'm saying doesn't preclude employing technology. In fact, a culture of security, by definition, is going to employ good technology, right? So there's an assumption in a secure culture that good protective technological layers exist. However, you and I also know that things get through. There's no such thing as perfect security. I don't know of a platform out there, and if there is one, I'd love to see it, that stops everything. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have employees doing that to confirm, because that's another layer of protection. But I don't think it's a burden, right? It's a burden if the expectation is you have to build 100 widgets by the end of the day. And oh, by the way, you also need to hover over every link, because then how do you get to 100 at the end of the day? So part of a culture of security includes expectations of output that meet the more restrictive burdens, to use your term, of compliance. But that creates, again, those are the rules in which we live by. So if I'm the employer and you're the employee, and you and I agree that, listen, if I don't have to do all of this, then I can put out 100 widgets. But if I have to do all this, the best I can do is 60. And I say, okay, I'm fine with that. Do you care if you have to do it anymore? Is it a burden anymore? No, it's just part of the job. And so it's incumbent upon everybody in the relationship understand that this culture of security are in fact governors that limit output. But in the long run, they increase output by preventing breaches and other things that stop output completely. I give you the Colonial Pipeline. I give you JB Meat Company. I can go down the list, and those are just the more recent ones, right? So the extra burden, to use your terms, is really a burden on the company, not the employee, because it just becomes part of what the employee. How is hovering over a link any different than putting another piece of the widget together? It's no different. It's just that I just can't put as many pieces in there now if I have to hover over every link. Does that make sense?
Yep. I mean, to your point, layered security is preferred, and obviously there are some things that humans can do better than machines. I was just kind of wanting to understand from you, like, how companies could set up the expectations, because to your point, that 25 million transfer, if there were no policies in place, that blame or burden should not be put on the employee. So I think that's an important piece, is setting culture and policy so everybody understands very clearly, there's no ambiguity.
No, we agree, and I don't think that, in that case, as an example, um, I think in that particular employee, I think put the burden on themselves because they felt so incredibly guilty about that. But ultimately, as I said to the CEO, it was a failure of leadership. Ultimately, you should have defined a process that protected the stakeholders of the company. And I look at stakeholders, when I talk about stakeholders of the company, stakeholders are employees, their families, management, leadership, boards of directors, vendors. It's everybody who has a relationship with that company. And 25 million, which is not a small amount of money. At $1 billion company, it's not a large amount of money either. It's incumbent upon leadership to put in place a culture of security and memorialize that through policy and procedure and ensure compliance so that everybody has the best experience they can. they have the most fun and do the least harm.
Speaking of finances, you told me that you had and ran many businesses prior to your MSSP, and you spoke about coming from the financial industry, which was very regulated. So what have you brought over to your MSSP business in terms of specialization coming from the financial industry?
One of the things that we do uniquely, I think, in many ways, is our approach to security and compliance is a holistic one. Because as I had mentioned to you before, I was not only CEO of two finance companies, I was also CCO, Chief Compliance Officer. And so I got to know the regulators very well. I got to really understand the way these things were constructed, and also understand the rationale for it, and why it was. It really helped me to form my entire opinion on compliance as actually a benefit and not a burden. Um, and so what I came to realize, and really what I think we do better than almost everybody else, is we take a very holistic approach to it, in that we look at security and compliance as being intimately related to one another, and culture necessarily so. And so when we take on an engagement, uh, there's a fairly large organization that we do some business for. And when we take on the engagement, we dive into the cultural aspect of the organization to craft a security policy technologically, and policy procedurally, and audit and escalation and all, to help them define and enforce a culture that makes them safer, more secure, and therefore more compliant.
And you serve a lot of customers in the finance industry. So, how much demand is there in compliance these days?
Oh my God, that is a compliance is. I come back to. I think we're in the best industry of anybody out there today. The cyber compliance is is what what plastics were in the 60s, is what the internet was in the 90s, is what is, I could sort of run down the list of big starting points that changed business writ large, and created industries out of thin air, and companies out of thin air. The the as the headlines continue to bear out, as states and countries begin to take up the mantle of I don't want to say enforcement, but protection, um, as the legal community begins to become the enforcement arm of governing bodies, there isn't a single business that isn't going to be required to have some form of cybersecurity and compliance solutions embedded in their culture. This started. You could argue it started with GDPR. I think it really started with New York's Department of Financial Services reg. It bled into California CCPA and New York Shield, and now Louisiana's law and Texas, and I can go down the list. I mean, nearly every state, almost, and but the better part of 24 countries have requirements of protecting personal data, of the consumer, ultimately of the consumer. Yeah, some of it's driven by politics. I'm not naive enough to think there's any altruism in the political sphere. Let me be clear about that. But that, by definition, means that every business is going to have this embedded as what they do. And what they're going to find is that if they don't, that they're going to be quickly out of business as liability cascades upstream, right? So if you look at CCPA, which requires that the supply chain itself maintain integrity of custody of PII, as well as identifying that upstream. And they've empowered the legal community to enforce it through class action suits. You've opened up a tremendously effective enforcement arm, and therefore fully expanded the compliance and cyber universe to every business that does business in the state of California, and now the state of New York, and in the EU with GDPR, and in Brazil with LGPD, and I can run down the litany of them, right? So, and the interesting thing is that if you read the way the language of these regulations, and now insurance, interesting enough. So I read cyber liability policies. I know that sounds so exciting to you, but even they're defining a lack of compliance means they won't pay. It's interesting, and so we're at a place now where not only must you demonstrate that you have a protective layer, you have to demonstrate that you actually have you're complying with the rules and policies, and they're basically defining culture in there. I think we're at a great place. It started in the financial service space, but it's gone well beyond that now. In our business, because of two prior businesses where I was in the financial service space and really cut my teeth on security and compliance, we are one of the largest providers of security and compliance solutions in the country, and I think we're the largest supplier in the Northeast. It's because we were early adopters because of my history in the space, and so it's been very lucrative for us. But that notwithstanding, anybody who isn't adopting this as a core service within their business, any IT provider, IT security provider, MSP, MSSP, that isn't adopting a compliance and security practice in their organization are going to be left behind, and left behind very quickly, because things are moving at unbelievable speed right now.
And what are like the pain points you hear the most from customers when you're engaging in these compliance conversations?
So it's you actually touched on it earlier. For them, it's how can we have the employees do this, or we can't burden them with that, or it's going to cost too much is a typical one. But again, depending on how you frame it, if you frame it from a risk mitigation standpoint, cost becomes a significantly smaller discussion. So I'll leave that off to the side, because people who tend to focus on cost, they're not really clients we do business with. Not because we're pompous, it's because if they don't understand the value in risk mitigation, I can't really help them. That's just our focus, is about mitigating risk. But mostly it's about, they're like everybody else. Organizations are nothing but organisms that operate in a certain way. And so changing their behavior is just as hard as changing an individual's behavior. And so helping them get there is actually, I think, where we shine. I think where we shine is in the MSP, and I know it's where we shine in CyberGuard. Our ability to provide, I mentioned this before, visibility, right? You can't expect what you can't inspect. And so giving them visibility into the A-bends, to use an old mainframe word, the A-bends in their system, give them an understanding of where they need to change, and then we tell them the how.
And as we wrap up here today, I wanted to just kind of close out with, how would you advise companies looking to work with a compliance partner? What sort of questions should they be asking? How can they know if they're working with a good partner?
Wait for my next book.
You got to give some teasers.
No, in all seriousness, and it is part of my next book, but let's leave that alone for a second. You gotta, there's some key things that you need to talk to them about. One of them is, what is their approach? I always tell the clients the prospects that we come in contact with, who ultimately become clients. What is the approach? What do we want to see, and what's the first step? Right. For a lot of those whose first step is, well, we're going to sell you this, run for the hills. Right? Because you don't know what they need until you've done some sort of risk assessment. And so any good security and compliance organization should always begin with an RA. And so if a company is in market, find out what the first step is. Don't even give them the hint the first one should be an RA. Like, what is it? How is our relationship going to begin? And it really has to start with an RA, because I don't know what I don't know. Right? I don't know, do I know iron scales? I know iron scales. Can I tell you how secure you are? No. How the hell would I know? Like, I would need to come in and do an RA. And an RA, if you think about the breadth of an RA is big. An RA engagement isn't a 5-minute questionnaire. I mean, administrative, technical, physical, there's subcategories under that. It's work. But it exposes. It's called a risk assessment for a reason, right? I don't know what your risk is until I can assess it, and so that's really how it has to begin. And the second thing I would say is look for people that they've done work for, and get colleague feedback. I always say, so if I said to you, how many references would you like? What would you say to me?
Anywhere from three north.
Right, 3. Everybody starts with 3. I always ask for 5. You know why I always ask for 5? Because everybody has 3.
Fair enough.
And I always want it by the end of the day. So I'm like, listen, by the end of today, just give me 5 references. Because they're going to have the 3 already waiting in the wings. It's the last 2 that I want to talk to. Those are the people, because if you can't come up with 5 references, and listen, there's going to be a lot of guys just starting out that aren't going to have 5 references. So, that doesn't mean they're not good at what they do, but I don't know that I want to I don't know that I want to risk my organization's compliance posture on them. I'm not saying they're bad or good. I'm just saying I don't know that I would want to. So I always ask for 5 references. I always call. So those are the things that I would do if I were sitting in the shoes of somebody looking to interview my company to handle their compliance and their cybersecurity.
Before we close out here today, is there anything else you would like to add that you think we missed?
If there's anything that I would say that I'd hope people take away from this podcast is compliance should be your friend. It should not be something you fear or something, or the broccoli you don't want to eat. Right? It's actually, it's a good thing. Again, it defines your relationship with everybody else around you. And you want to know the ground rules. You should know the ground rules to the way we're playing this game. And it will let everybody have the most fun by doing the least amount of harm. And so if they take anything away from that, they should take that. If they really want 2 things to take away, they should do business with us.
Well, now's your 30-second pitch before we wrap up. How would you like to connect with people if they have more questions, and maybe give us a 30 seconds pitch on what you guys do?
Sure. So I'll start with contact information so they don't tune out too soon. If you want to reach me, you can reach me by email at aalper@cyberguard360.com. That's AALP as in Papa, ER as in Romeo at cyberguard360.com. Or you can go to cyberguard360.com and see us. Our platform is PII Guard. That's the platform I was talking about earlier. We call it securing the human endpoint, is the sort of our tagline. In that platform, we provide dark web monitoring, simulated phishing, risk assessments, HIPAA assessments, simulated phishing, document management. Our policy management module is a rock star in the industry. We win awards all the time. But But realistically, while we compete in all of those areas, one of our claims to fame is no contracts, no minimums, no kidding, right? We don't have any contracts. We have no minimums. You use our pieces of our platform. You pay for what you use. When you're not using it, you don't pay for it. But perhaps the most important thing we do, and I know a lot of people come to us for dark web monitoring. A lot of people come to us for simulated phishing and awareness training. But the most important thing we do is we provide visibility. We provide a way for our MSP partners to demonstrate to their clients where their employees are falling down, where they're less than secure, or maybe just demonstrate that they are secure. It gives their clients the ability to inspect and therefore expect.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Al. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you today. I'm going to assume people can also reach out to you on LinkedIn.
I'm available on LinkedIn. I wish I knew it, but I'm out there.
We can. We'll add it in the show notes, so no pressure.
I appreciate it. I don't know the whole URL, but it's Al_Alper is what it's. So it's LinkedIn/N, I think, or EN or /Al_Alper is the easy way to. People see me all over the place. Unfortunately, I don't know if that's good or bad, but happy to answer anybody's questions. They have them. Happy to talk about. I mean, I'm passionate about what I do. If it isn't obvious here, I happen to love what I do. So I couldn't imagine doing anything else, frankly.
Thank you so much, Al. So again, thanks for your time today, and thanks for joining us, everybody, on Cybersecurity Heroes today. Until next time, we'll see you then.
That's a wrap for this episode of Cybersecurity Heroes. Practical and experiential knowledge on a day in the life of security heroes. Catch our next episode by subscribing through your favorite podcast platform. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating for the show. They really help a lot. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.